Dr. Davis, thank you for coming out and talking to me today and talking to our class about the 1912 presidential election. I've always considered it one of the more interesting elections in American history, and I thought it would be a valuable experience to let our students hear more about it. And I know you have an expertise in presidential politics and elections in particular. Just want to start out with getting your impressions of, in terms of uniqueness, how would you rate this 1912 election and why?
Well, you know, every presidential election is deemed as important. Almost every presidential election year, candidates and pundits insist that this is the most important presidential election in our lifetime. 1912 really was an important election. And it's unique, I think, in that it's drawing together a number of individuals onto a single stage. You have economists, you have politicians, social reformers, intellectuals, all coming into one arena. And on that arena, they're engaging in a national debate about America's social, political, and economic future. Its ultimate uniqueness may lay just in its significance, its lasting significance. There are several things that stand out, I think, as significant about 1912. One is that the Republican Party splits in two. The progressive wing of the party separates itself from the conservative wing of the party. And though this may be a major oversimplification, the Republican Party will increasingly, over the course of the 20th century on into the 21st, become identified as the conservative party. The progressives never really return. Again, that may be a little bit of an oversimplification, but the Republican Party becomes more conservative after the progressives break away. A second thing is that a Democrat is finally elected. Between 1860 and 1932, not counting 1932, you only have two Democrats elected. One was here in 1912, Woodrow Wilson. And then finally, the Democratic Party, just as the Republican Party was becoming more conservative, the Democratic Party was becoming more liberal.
It is interesting because this election is happening right smack in the middle of this, what we like to call the progressive era, which is this era of so much change in the country. And I know the students will be reading about that, and it's just, you know, dealing with change makes oftentimes elections prominent. So thank you for that insight. You talk about the split in the parties. You know, what were, I guess, can you identify the major parties and how they chose or why they chose their respective candidates? Were there any surprises maybe in who was nominated? Because it is a fascinating divide.
Yeah. The Democrats will meet and have a raucous convention, as always, as conventions tended to be in those days. But they settle relatively early on Woodrow Wilson. Champ Clark of Missouri was a leading contender, but ultimately it's Wilson, and he's a progressive. The Democratic Party was riddled with all sorts of internal divisions, just as the Republican Party was. But Wilson has more of a reputation as a progressive. He's not as radical as Bryan. He's not as conservative as some of the Democratic candidates, say, in 1904. Wilson comes to the Democratic nomination as a progressive. Republicans will split. They have a major problem between President William Howard Taft and his predecessor, former President Theodore Roosevelt. The two men were incredibly close. And so at one level, it's just an incredibly sad story, the disintegration of a friendship. William Howard Taft served as President of the United States from 1909 to 1913. He never really wanted to be president. His goal in life was to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And his background was in legal affairs and judicial affairs, even though he had served as governor of the Philippines and Secretary of War under TR. But TR persuades him to run in 1908, and he does, and he wins. And so as Taft is gearing up for re-election, there are a number of things that are going to contribute to this split between him and his predecessor, who had been the one to encourage him to run in the first place. One of the things that contributes to this split between TR, this personal split between TR and Taft, which is going to have political ramifications, is just a difference a different conception of executive power. Roosevelt has a very broad conception of executive power. Taft has a very narrow one. And so Taft's narrow view of executive power, he believes that the president can only do what is clearly spelled out in Article 2 of the Constitution, and that there is, as he wrote later, no undefined residuum of power that the president can tap into just because he thinks it serves the public interest. Roosevelt believed that the president had the obligation, had the right to actually do what was in the public interest. Taft has a major difference with that. And so this is going to manifest itself in his actual approach to his job, including his refusal to interfere with congressional debate with tariff revision. Progressives want a lower tariff. Taft wants a lower tariff, but he's not willing to interject himself into the congressional debate and twist arms, as presidents can sometimes do just by virtue of being president. You can call someone up, go up to Capitol Hill, twist some arms, and they'll vote your way. Progressives wanted Taft to do that. Taft believed that was a violation of separation of powers. And so he will not. Tariff reform goes down. Progressives are disappointed. And ultimately, Roosevelt will be too. Roosevelt was not in the country at the time. But this is one of the things that contributes to their split. Another thing will be an internal Taft administration scandal, the Ballinger pension affair, involving Taft's Secretary of Interior and his head of the Forest Service. He ultimately fires Penchant, who was the forest head and a very close friend of TR. And so that's another thing. A third thing will be Taft denying Roosevelt a chairmanship of the state GOP convention in New York in the lead up to the 1910 midterm elections. This was embarrassing. Taft wanted Roosevelt to give a statement that he supported Taft in exchange for this position. When TR refuses to do that, Taft sabotages his efforts to become chair of the GOP convention. This is embarrassing for a former president, especially one with the ego of TR, to actually be denied the chairmanship of his own state's GOP state convention. And so that's going to result in some hurt feelings. And then finally, it'll be Taft's prosecution of U.S. Steel. This comes, I believe, in early 1911. U.S. Steel, the Taft administration charge was in violation of antitrust laws. Roosevelt is particularly offended by that because just a few years earlier, when he was president, he had told U.S. Steel, what you're doing is okay, everything is great, and now Taft is coming back and saying, actually, TR did something wrong. Not a good thing. In early 1912 then, Roosevelt announced that his hat was in the ring and that he was fit and ready to go and challenge Taft in the Republican primaries.
And then Taft was able to prevail there in the primary, and so Roosevelt splits off and forms or creates the Progressive Party.
Yeah, it was a very nasty primary fight. Roosevelt actually wins most of those primaries. Taft wins the Massachusetts primary. The big important primary for the two was Ohio. That was Taft's home state, and he wants to win there, and it becomes just a slugfest. Both candidates campaign. In those days, there were very few primaries, and it becomes a very nasty affair. Taft will call Roosevelt a dangerous egotist, a flatterer of the people, whereas TR will call Taft a puzzle wit and a fathead. Taft was not happy with this whole exchange. In fact, at one point during the primary campaign, Taft had been speaking, and a reporter was to interview him after the speech. The president was on his rail car, and the reporter walks in, and the president's sitting in a chair alone. And the reporter uneasily walks on in and says, "Sir," and Taft is crying. Taft looks up at the reporter and says, "Roosevelt was my closest friend." He then lowers his head and continues to sob.
And so we come into the presidential campaign in 1912. Got Republican Party split. We could, just for time's sake, won't talk about it, but we've got a socialist party that is actually emerging during this time of Eugene Debs, and so that as another complicating factor. And then you got Wilson running as a Democratic candidate. Thinking of the split in the Republican Party, was there any realistic way for Wilson to have lost?
Well, you know, it's interesting. After TR loses at the convention, after all, the president in those days held the keys to the party. In many ways, the president still does today. In those days, only a few primaries, so most delegates are chosen by the state party machinery, which the president controlled. Taft then wins the nomination. TR breaks away and forms the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party, as it was popularly known. And he champions what he calls the new nationalism. Calling for graduated income tax, the end of child labor, and a number of other reforms. But Taft and Roosevelt will campaign pretty hard against each other, and it looks like TR might actually prevail in the fall campaign, and pundits increase his odds after an event that happens in October of 1912. TR travels to Milwaukee, where he's going to give a major speech before a large stadium crowd. On his way into the stadium, he stands up in the back of a car and waves at cheering admirers, and he's shot by a deranged man named John Schrank. His name's not important, but Schrank believed that William McKinley's ghost had appeared and informed him that he needed to kill Roosevelt because he was essentially seeking a third term, and that a president shouldn't do that. At any rate, Roosevelt is shot. He's shot in the chest, and amazingly, he continues on into the stadium. He'll be introduced. Most people in the crowd didn't know he'd been shot, and so he's introduced. The man who introduces him tells the crowd, Mr. Roosevelt has been shot. We don't know how long he can stand and talk. Roosevelt goes on to speak for an hour, but his life was probably saved by his speech. He had rolled up his speech, it was about 50 pages long, and put it in his front right chest pocket. And the bullet went through that 50-page speech.
Slowed it down some.
It slowed it down, and he has to be taken to the hospital after he delivers his speech, in which he insists, I'm not running for president because I have insane ambition, which is what Taft was charging and what Wilson was insinuating too, but because I want to help workers who are overworked and underpaid. But he's taken to the hospital, and the campaign is suspended for a while. Debs cancels his campaign appearances, Wilson and Taft, they all three do. And some pundits believe that Roosevelt's chances for victory may have increased with that. In the end, of course, it's close, but it's going to be a Wilson and Democratic victory.
So Wilson ultimately wins. Would he have won if it was just Taft or if it was just Roosevelt?
I don't think so. When you look at the numbers, it's interesting. Woodrow Wilson, who wins in 1912, actually got fewer votes than the loser of 1908 in both the popular vote and in the percentages. In 1908, William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic nominee, only got 43% of the vote. Taft got 52% back in 1908. In 1912, Wilson comes in below the numbers that Bryan got. He got only about 42% of the vote. But when you look at those Republican numbers, if you put TR's number and Taft's numbers together, Roosevelt has 28% of the vote in 1912. Taft has 23. 23 plus 28, if my math is correct, that's 51%, just a point lower than what Taft got in 1908. And so it's clear that that the Republican Party being split hurt the Republicans and helped Wilson. But the conventional wisdom was that Taft could not prevail in 1912. Taft actually tried to get the governor, the former governor of New York, Charles Evans Hughes, who had been appointed to the Supreme Court by Taft, to be the consensus candidate. Hughes refuses, and so Taft and Roosevelt are going to slug it out.
Well, just in closing, what do you think are the most significant legacies of this election, for I guess then or later?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, I think, and that is in this campaign, you see the Republican Party emerge over time as a distinctly conservative party. It doesn't happen come 1913 or 1914. It's something that is gradual over the course of the 20th century. But those progressives who leave in 1912 and follow the Roosevelt banner will by 1916, gravitate toward the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson will implement a lot of the progressive measures. Progressives were divided in 1912 between TR and Wilson, but with Wilson in office, actually implementing banking reform, tariff reform, and prosecuting trust, things that TR probably would have done too. They're going to be obliged to stay with him, especially with the becoming of World War I. And progressives tend to be a little more anti-war. They're going to appreciate Wilson's reluctant stance in the lead up to World War I, whereas TR, who rejoins the Republican Party by 1916, appears more as a warmonger to these progressives. Thus, these progressives, by and large, will stay within the Democratic Party. Some will return, but over time the Republican Party becomes the more distinctly conservative one, the Democratic Party becoming the more liberal one.
Well, Dr. Davis, I appreciate you sharing your expertise on the 1912 election, and just fascinating. And all these individuals that we talked about, many others are fascinating. And I encourage students to go back and look at the election and how the campaign went in each one to get a full flavor of American history. Thank you again.
All right, thank you.